On Saturday, Vladimir Putin declared a ceasefire, 30 hours of silence in honor of Easter. No more drone strikes, no artillery fire, no killing, just peace. At least, that's what he said. But while Orthodox Christians gathered in churches and Western leaders cautiously applauded, something else was happening. Air raid sirens were blaring in Kyiv. Missiles were flying, drones were already in the sky. Within minutes of Putin's peace offering, the war hadn't stopped, it had shifted. So what was this really about? A step toward diplomacy or a tactical PR stunt to manipulate global opinion? Let's break down the lie behind the so-called truce and what it means for the future of this war. To fully understand the weight and implications of Putin's so-called Easter ceasefire, we need to go back to the hours leading up to his announcement, a moment shrouded not in hope but in suspicion. On the surface, it looked like a rare glimmer of humanity in an otherwise brutal and unrelenting war. The Kremlin released a video of President Vladimir Putin, flanked by his top general, solemnly declaring a 30-hour truce in observance of Easter from 6 p.m. Saturday to midnight Sunday. His language was carefully chosen. Guided by humanitarian considerations, he said, the Russian military would halt all military activity along the front line. In the background, the Cathedral of Christ the Savior loomed, and within hours, Putin would be seen attending Easter Mass, flanked by Patriarch Kirill, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church and a loyal ally in the war effort. But the timing of this announcement raised immediate red flags. The declaration came less than 48 hours after the U.S. President Donald Trump, frustrated by what he called a bloodbath in Ukraine, delivered an ultimatum. Either Russia and Ukraine made visible progress toward a ceasefire, or the U.S. would walk away from negotiations altogether. His Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, echoed the sentiment, warning that America would take a pass on any further peace efforts if both parties continued to act in bad faith. It was a clear diplomatic shot across the bow, aimed squarely at the Kremlin. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, Putin's truce. To some, this might have looked like a step in the right direction. But to most, especially those in Ukraine, it smelled like something else entirely. Damage control, PR, a stunt. President Volodymyr Zelenskyy didn't wait long to respond. His tone was sharp and unambiguous. In a post on X, he accused Putin of trying to manipulate global perception, calling the ceasefire a carefully staged illusion. The Russian army is attempting to create the general impression of a ceasefire, he said, but in some areas they are still continuing isolated attempts to advance and inflict losses on Ukraine. According to Zelenskyy, this was not a ceasefire. It was a masquerade. A strategy to earn headlines in the West, to sway skeptics in Washington, and to dodge the mounting pressure coming from an increasingly impatient U.S. administration. Zelenskyy's skepticism was not without merit. After all, this wasn't the first time Putin had announced a unilateral truce during a religious holiday. A similar ceasefire was declared in January 2023 for Orthodox Christmas, and it too was violated within hours. In fact, from the very moment this year's Easter truce began, Ukrainian officials reported the same pattern. Drone strikes, artillery fire, and ground assaults continued across multiple regions. So why announce a ceasefire at all? The answer perhaps lies in the strategic theater of global diplomacy. With the Trump administration threatening to abandon its mediating role and with talks of a U.S.-Ukraine minerals deal on the horizon, Russia needed to appear reasonable just long enough to shift the narrative. By declaring a truce, even a short one, Putin could claim moral high ground. He could argue that Russia, not Ukraine, was willing to stop the bloodshed. And when the ceasefire inevitably broke down, he could point the finger westward and say, "We tried." But despite the Kremlin's narrative, the facts on the ground told a very different story. Ukrainian intelligence tracked nearly 450 Russian artillery strikes during the ceasefire window. Drones continued to patrol Ukrainian skies, with some frontline areas reporting over 300 drone-related incidents. By dawn on Easter Sunday, there were already reports of ambushes, civilian casualties, and frontline clashes. In the village of Zoria, Russian drones reportedly attacked a civilian evacuation convoy, injuring aid workers. And yet, Moscow continued to insist it was observing the truce strictly. To make matters worse, there was no clear mechanism for monitoring or verifying the ceasefire. No neutral observers, no transparency, no hotline between commanders. The entire truce was declared unilaterally, and enforcement depended entirely on the word of the Kremlin, a government notorious for manipulating the truth in both war and peace. And so, the stage was set for what would become one of the most surreal diplomatic performances of the war. On paper, the guns were silent. On the ground, they were very much alive. And in the halls of power, in Kyiv, in Moscow, in Washington, nerves were fraying. What was supposed to be the most significant pause in a 3-year-long war, a conflict that has claimed tens of thousands of lives, instead revealed how fragile and politicized the very idea of peace has become. This wasn't just a failed truce, it was a global test. And both sides were about to show their cards. Whatever illusions remained about the sincerity of Putin's ceasefire evaporated almost immediately. Within hours of the official start time, the so-called pause in hostilities collapsed into yet another chapter of violence. Across the front lines, the unmistakable signs of war, droning engines, scattered shelling, sudden flashes on the horizon, resumed their dreadful routine. By midnight Saturday, the Ukrainian military reported dozens of Russian assaults. Between that hour and 4 p.m. Sunday, Ukrainian intelligence documented 46 separate attacks from Russian forces. These weren't isolated incidents. This was a coordinated continuation of warfare, only now cloaked in the hypocrisy of a truce. Russian artillery alone fired nearly 450 times within that short window, and Ukrainian officials stated that more than 900 Russian drones had been deployed, many of them the infamous kamikaze drones that have become a hallmark of Moscow's terror campaigns. Drone strikes were especially heavy in the Donetsk and Zaporizhia regions, areas already ravaged by months of trench warfare and creeping offensives. Ukraine, for its part, did not remain idle. Zelenskyy had made it clear, if Russian troops remained silent, so would Ukrainian forces. But if the attacks continued as they did, Ukraine would respond symmetrically. That symmetry, in the language of war, meant retaliation, and retaliate they did. Russian border towns like Belgorod and Kursk came under attack, with Ukraine's military confirming strikes aimed at pushing back encroaching forces and stopping sabotage groups from regaining ground. Explosions were heard in the occupied city of Donetsk, with pro-Russian sources accusing Ukrainian saboteurs of carrying out strikes during the supposed truce. Both sides, now fully re-engaged, accused the other of breaking the ceasefire first. The Russian Defense Ministry took its usual route: denial. In a statement, it claimed its troops had been strictly observing the ceasefire and pointed the finger at Kyiv, accusing Ukrainian forces of launching over 1,000 violations. They claimed 444 separate incidents of Ukrainian shelling and over 900 drone attacks aimed not just at military targets, but civilian infrastructure in Crimea and several Russian regions. Moscow's narrative was one of victimhood, painting itself as the restrained party under siege. But the reality on the ground told a messier, bloodier story. Ukrainian military spokesmen in the east described the day as just another day of war. In frontline towns like Novopavlivka and Lyman, the fighting never stopped. Footage emerged from the village of Uspenivka in Donetsk Oblast, showing smoke rising into the air, proof that the so-called truce had meant nothing to the soldiers entrenched in combat. Ukrainian forces reported at least 16 drone attacks and multiple artillery strikes in a single sector, while in Zuria, near the city of Kostyantynivka, a humanitarian convoy was hit by Russian drones. 2 civilians and a rescue worker from a local aid agency were injured in the attack. The violence was neither accidental nor sporadic, it was methodical. The 66th Brigade of Ukraine's army, stationed near Lyman, reported continued Russian infantry attacks, as well as attempts to repair and reinforce damaged crossings. Actions that suggested the Kremlin was using the ceasefire as a tactical pause, an opportunity to regroup and strengthen their positions while the world watched with crossed fingers and naive optimism. Meanwhile, Russian military bloggers, usually staunch supporters of the war effort, began to post their own doubts. Some acknowledged that while the number of attacks had dipped in certain areas, the front lines were anything but quiet. The so-called lull wasn't a gesture of goodwill, it was a strategic recalibration. The Kremlin's PR stunt had little to do with peace and everything to do with buying time and changing the story. What unfolded over those 30 hours was a farce, an exercise in managed optics rather than a genuine attempt at de-escalation. On the diplomatic stage, Moscow could now say it had offered peace, however brief, only for Ukraine to reject it. It's the oldest trick in the book: create chaos, then point to the other side when the dust doesn't settle. And so, as the truce came to a quiet end at midnight on Sunday, the war simply marched on, uninterrupted, unrepentant, and more politically charged than ever. Both sides had returned to open conflict, the brief window of supposed peace serving only to underscore the distrust, the deception, and the devastating futility that defines this war. So the question becomes, why even bother? Why stage a ceasefire with no intention of keeping it? Because in geopolitics, sometimes the illusion of peace is more powerful than peace itself. Analysts and Western diplomats were quick to recognize the real timing behind the truce. Just days earlier, the Trump administration had begun to signal frustration with the lack of diplomatic progress in Ukraine. President Trump himself, speaking bluntly as ever, warned that if neither Kyiv nor Moscow showed a willingness to take negotiations seriously, the United States would take a pass on peace efforts. The messaging was loud, clear, and directed at both combatants. But it was Putin who flinched first, or at least pretended to. The ceasefire announcement came almost immediately after this diplomatic shot across the bow, suggesting not a spontaneous act of compassion, but a premeditated attempt to regain the narrative and reposition Russia as the party interested in ending the war. But while the Kremlin may have hoped the world would see the truce as a sign of restraint, the reality was that it served a much more cynical purpose. By declaring a ceasefire, however brief, and then accusing Ukraine of violating it, Putin gained two strategic advantages. First, he painted himself as the reasonable actor in an unreasonable conflict, a leader willing to give diplomacy a chance only to be rebuffed. Second, he laid the groundwork for a future escalation that he could justify as retaliatory. If the illusion of peace is shattered, after all, who better to blame than the opponent who refused to honor it? Ukraine, of course, saw through the charade immediately. President Zelenskyy not only rejected the authenticity of the ceasefire, but countered with a proposal of his own. A 30-day comprehensive truce, one that would allow for meaningful diplomatic and humanitarian progress. Russia dismissed it outright. The reason is obvious. A longer truce would have required genuine compliance, real restraint, and most dangerously for Moscow, international scrutiny. A 30-hour ceasefire, on the other hand, was short enough to be symbolic, vague enough to be manipulated, and ineffective enough to change absolutely nothing on the battlefield. It wasn't meant to stop the war, it was meant to stop the headlines. Meanwhile, in Washington, patience continued to wear thin. Trump's inner circle, including Secretary of State Marco Rubio, met with European leaders in Paris to discuss the possibility of brokering a final settlement. But leaks from the negotiations painted a sobering picture. The White House, desperate for a diplomatic win ahead of an election cycle, appeared willing to consider deeply controversial concessions, some as dramatic as recognizing Crimea as Russian territory and freezing the conflict along existing battle lines. In the eyes of Kyiv, these weren't compromises, they were betrayals. The political tension was compounded by economic shifts occurring behind the scenes. While peace talks faltered, Ukraine and the U.S. were preparing to sign a new minerals agreement, an 80-page deal giving Washington access to strategic resources buried deep in Ukrainian soil. Though the exact terms remain undisclosed, insiders suggest the U.S. had relaxed its demands for financial repayment, slashing aid reimbursement expectations from $300 billion to $100 billion. This potential realignment of economic interests introduces another layer of complexity. Russia's war may no longer be just about territory or influence, it may also be about who gets to extract Ukraine's future wealth. These maneuverings, both on the battlefield and in back rooms, are not new. In fact, this entire episode mirrors previous ceasefire announcements by Russia that were similarly short-lived and self-serving. One such event took place in January 2023 when Putin declared a Christmas truce that was almost immediately broken by coordinated Russian attacks. Western leaders at the time dismissed it as a thinly veiled attempt to buy time for regrouping and rearming. History, it seems, is not repeating itself, it's being copy-pasted. What makes this moment more volatile is how little faith remains in the process. On all sides, trust is evaporating. The Biden administration once tried to act as a neutral broker. Now, under Trump, America's taking a more transactional approach, issuing ultimatums and leveraging financial deals as tools of persuasion. Ukraine, once buoyed by unshakable Western support, now finds itself navigating mixed messages and diminishing returns. And Russia, facing a population weary of war and an economy increasingly isolated, is resorting to theater grand gestures with no substance, just to keep itself in the conversation. As the sun set on the 30-hour ceasefire and missiles resumed their arc across the skies of Donetsk and Zaporizhia, the world was left with a sobering realization. This wasn't a step toward peace. It was a rehearsal for the next phase of propaganda, a calculated act of misdirection. And yet, as hollow as it was, the ceasefire may have revealed something deeper than military strategy. It showed us how fragile diplomacy has become, how quickly a peace gesture can become a weapon, and how dangerously easy it is to manipulate the appearance of progress in a world starved for resolution. So now the question is yours to answer. Was this ceasefire a genuine step toward peace, or just another manipulative stunt in a long, cynical playbook? Was Putin signaling a new diplomatic chapter, or simply buying time and headlines? I want to hear what you think. Drop your take in the comments, and let's open this up for real debate.